from your role in Alexander Hamilton Society. I've had the privilege of addressing a number of universities, a number of your chapters, and I commend you all for really kind of initiating, sustaining what I think is a great dialogue on U.S. national security policy. So it's a real privilege for me to be here. And I'm really keen not only just to share my views, but also get your reactions to them and get also your views on this war. Second, I also want to commend you for, I think you're Ukrainian. So my heart goes out to you and all the people of Ukraine. I have a soft spot in my heart for Ukraine because I spent 2 years of my life in Ukraine in 1993 and in 1994 as a volunteer in Kiev. It's a great country and some of my best years of my life. I mean, you're arranging this conference at, just on the cusp of the third anniversary of this invasion, not of the invasion, of the second phase of what is now a 14-year invasion of Ukraine. And just in the last 3 years alone, we've seen probably over 500,000 Ukrainian combatant casualties, that is, soldiers who have been killed or wounded in Ukraine. If you look at the United States and you look at the Vietnam War, where we had 50,000 killed, that would be the equivalent of what happens in Ukraine to having 4 million killed in war. So that's the magnitude of the catastrophe that this war has imposed on Ukraine. It's a war of unspeakable Russian atrocities. Maybe I just turn this off because I don't think I can speak pretty loud. But, we're talking about summary executions over and over and over again of Ukrainian prisoners of war captured by the Russians, often right on the battlefield. We're talking about brutal torture, not just of captured soldiers, but Ukrainian civilians. We're talking about mass rapes as a tool. We're talking about the kidnapping of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children in an effort to re-educate them in Soviet-style camps by Putin. We're talking about a systematic destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure, a systematic attempt by the Russians, by Putin, to basically starve out and freeze out the Ukrainian population from their lands. And this has been happening before us in real time, where we see it every day. It's also a war that's featured unbelievable courage and determination of the Ukrainian people, who are sacrificing their lives not only to defend their country's freedom, their cultures, their ethnicity's existence, but our freedom and our security. So thank you for hosting this series today. So what is at stake for the United States? I'd say there are 5 or 6 things at stake. First of all, there's literally the existence of a democratic country that has acted as a de facto ally of the United States, helping to secure the Euro-Atlantic community's eastern frontier, contributing to U.S.-led operations globally, be it in the Balkans, in the Middle East, off the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan. These are Ukrainians who went out there not as an ally, but technically as a partner, acting as a de facto ally. And I'm serious. This is talking about an existential moment for Ukraine, because Putin is literally determined to crush this population, to seize its territory, but above all to erase Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history. This is genocidal, and we haven't seen this since World War II in Europe. The second factor that's in play is the future of the rules-based international order. That set of rules and principles that emerged out of World War II to prevent war from happening again, and that has been the basis for an exceptional spread and growth of freedom, prosperity, and peace around the world. A lot of people may say that's global gobbledygook, that's international theory, don't bother me with that.
Well, if you're of that attitude, you're probably an attitude who has great respect and appreciation for the principle of sovereignty. And that is being trampled upon right now by the Russians, by Putin. And if we don't have respect and we're not going to have the willing to stand up for that principle of sovereignty, we're pushing ourselves back to a world order where might is right and where peace and negotiation don't define international affairs, but rather violence and invasion define international affairs. The third factor that's in play here is the role of nuclear weapons in international competition. Putin, to date, has effectively used nuclear coercion to basically advance his invasion of Ukraine. He has used it effectively to prevent the United States and its allies from intervening more forcefully in support of Ukraine. That is a recipe for further nuclear coercion. I mean, think about it. When you reward nuclear coercion, and think about it, no boots on the ground, the hesitancy of how we provided weapons and systems to Ukraine, the restrictions we put on their use. When you reward a threat, you reward nuclear coercion, you're inviting it to happen again and again. And that has been the case in Ukraine, where Putin has escalated his threats, deployed weapons to Belarus, even moving around nuclear weapons to signal potential use. And I believe it's human nature that if someone keeps on threatening something, it's just human nature that you're actually increasing more likelihood to act on that threat. So instead of preventing an escalation of the likelihood of use of nuclear weapons, we created a dynamic where increasing the possibility that people would actually use these things. That's a dangerous world, and it certainly contributes or adds to a proliferation dynamic. Because adversaries out in the world who are saying, how do I intimidate the United States? Well, your case study is Ukraine increases your proclivity to acquire nuclear weapons. And there's not just our adversaries, there's a debate in South Korea going on whether or not they should acquire nuclear weapons to deter China and North Korea. Russia's own evolution is another factor in play here. Now here I'm stealing from my father's writings. My father was a political scientist, a professor of international relations, who focused on the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, he was very worried about Russia's effort to kind of re-suborn Ukraine. And he always said that, if you want to prevent Russia from continuing to be an empire, if you want to increase Russia's prospects of evolving into a democracy, don't allow it to suborn Ukraine. Because if it suborns Ukraine, it will continue to be an empire, and an empire cannot, by definition, be a democracy. The fifth factor in play is the credibility of NATO and therefore the United States. We have described this war as existential to our interests, to our security. Yet, we're not acting in a way that decisively uses our overmatch compared to Russia. I mean, what does it say when we're being pushed around by a country that has 1/25th the GDP of NATO? NATO has GDP of about $54 trillion, $55 trillion, Russia less than 2. NATO allies spend about $1.5 trillion on defense. Russia spends roughly $150, $120 billion, less than 1/10. And yet we're unable or unwilling to enable Ukraine to decisively defeat a brutal, barbaric invasion by essentially a munchkin compared to our power. It says a lot about our political will and our credibility to our war, our word, our willingness to actually fight for our interests and values. And if that is all, stuff that some might say, that's just, again, international relations theory, this is distant stuff, doesn't affect our interests. Let me put it this way. What's happening in Ukraine is high-intensity conflict of the type we haven't seen since World War II. And it is inextricably linked to growing violence in the Middle East and China's increasing assertiveness and aggression in the Indo-Pacific. All three of those contingencies are driven by an alliance some people call an axis of upheaval of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And I really believe that we are on the cusp what could be a catastrophic global conflagration. And if you're going to preclude that from happening, you stop the war in Ukraine on terms that is a clear defeat for the aggressor. And we can do that because we have the overmatch. You defeat Russia and Ukraine, probably make Russia look inward looking. You basically remove one of the key drivers of this coalition of aggression or upheaval. You send a powerful message to China, to Iran, to North Korea, that no, the West hasn't lost its political will to win, to defend its interests and its values. It will act, and it will act decisively. So that's what's at stake in this conflict.
Yeah, so we see there's really a lot, and it's not only about Ukraine. It targets a lot of sort of the world as a whole, our democratic values, peace in the world. So Ukraine is not fighting for itself only; it's basically fighting for what you just said, which is at stake. And at this point, it's just what Ukraine should do and how Ukraine can sustain and keep this fight as long as this fight is needed. And maybe I think that would interest many people here in this room, especially the relationship with NATO. Could it that be possible? Why is NATO important to the U.S. and is there a possible future for Ukraine in NATO?
Well, why is NATO important in the United States? NATO's primary mission, in my view, and I'm kind of in the minority on this, is to throw lead down range. It's to build, sustain, and when necessary, lead an international coalition of democratic nations into battle. It's the pointy edge of the sword, so to speak, of the transatlantic community, democratic nations arsenal. But NATO's more than just an ability to throw lead down range. It brings to the table two other things. One, it brings economic magnitude. I just mentioned it's got $54 trillion in GDP. That's nearly half of GDP, and it's far larger than any of our adversaries. Far larger than China's, 25 times that of Russia. Economic power counts. NATO helps marshal that. NATO also brings to the battlefield, so to speak, political legitimacy that comes with a community of democracies. It's not a perfect community of democracies. It never has been, but it's always been getting closer and closer to that. And no one thinks any institution has got more political credibility or political legitimacy than the alliance. And that's a force multiplier. Because when you send troops into battle, if they're fighting for a good cause, if they're fighting for a good institution, for the interests of community democracies, they're probably more motivated, more determined than their adversaries led by an autocracy or a regime characterized by torture and abuse. So unmatched military capacity backed by real economic magnitude and political legitimacy. That's what NATO brings to the United States. And in that regard, it is a force multiplier. Again, if that is just too ethereal for you, think about this. When NATO was operating in Afghanistan, I think it was in 2011, there were roughly 45,000 Europeans in theater supporting what essentially is a U.S. operation. 40,000 troops in field. That amounts actually to 120,000 troops, because you always have one, for every soldier in the field, you have one that's training up for the mission, and then one that's recovering, and then one that's in the mission. So that's 120,000 U.S. troops that didn't have to be committed to that mission. It's a U.S.-led mission. And that's a force multiplying effect that we shouldn't take for granted. And you said, what about Ukraine and NATO? I've long advocated for Ukrainian membership in NATO. I was working on that even when it wasn't popular in Ukraine, when I was there in '93 and '94. Ukraine would strengthen NATO. It's got a military of 800,000 troops. It's the most battle-hardened member of the transatlantic community. We can learn a lot from the Ukrainians about how to manage, counter our adversary, particularly Russia. When it comes down to NATO membership, people come up with a list of 1,001 things, what a country has to do. I just wish they would look at the article, the NATO treaty itself. And it's pretty darn simple. You go to Article 10, and I actually brought the quote here. Read it to you. Article 10, quote, the parties, this is the NATO member states, may by unanimous consent, it's an important point, unanimous consent, invite any other European state in a position to further the principles of the treaty, and contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area to accede to the treaty. So you may invite any country that meets those requirements. So what are those requirements? You got to be a European state. Last I checked, Ukraine is in Europe. It's got to be committed to democratic principles. Ukraine is a democracy. Not only is it a democracy, it's a resilient democracy. It has had multiple free and fair parliamentary and presidential elections. A couple of those elections have faced direct interference by Russia. In one case, they ran them again, and they had a free and fair election. That's pretty darn good. Proven, so to speak, in the conflict of fire, under fire. So, got to be Europe, got to be committed to democratic principles, and you got to contribute to the defense of the North Atlantic area. Well, show me a country that today is sacrificing more than Ukraine in blood and treasure than Ukraine. The only missing element we have under Article 10 is unanimous consent. And it saddens me, the United States is one of those countries that's really blocking Ukraine's accession to NATO. And I'll tell you this, even if we didn't have full consensus and with the United States, and right now if the United States was on board, we wouldn't. Probably Hungary would block, probably Slovakia would block, and then probably, I guarantee you, Turkey would negotiate something out of it, but they'd swing around. If the United States came in and said, we want Ukraine in and we want it now, even though it may not happen right now, that would be about as close as you get to full membership, because the world would know it's going to happen. Because eventually the Hungarians and the Slovaks would fold under that pressure. So, Ukraine's ready. It'd be in our interest. It would strengthen the alliance. It'd probably be the fastest way to end this war. I'm among those who think we should extend membership to Ukraine now. Because Ukrainian membership in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the article that says, all for one, one for all, will defend you if you're attacked. That's the one thing that Putin recognizes. And if he saw NATO membership extended to Ukraine, then he'd be convinced that Ukraine is no longer in a gray zone, vulnerable, available to his hegemonic ambitions.
I think it was a very good overview in terms of NATO. And here, if I may, related to NATO, I have kind of sub-questions. So from what we've heard, especially at the university, at the academia, that one of the potential reasons that prevent Ukraine to become a NATO member state might be the fact that countries might be afraid of the Russian nuclear potential and the fact they might decide to deploy if Ukraine joins NATO. So I'm just wondering what you're opinion in this regard. And my second question in relation to this, what you just said, is Article 5. How realistic is that this article will be deployed? Because we don't have any examples in the history when countries would activate Article 5, and especially we've seen the moments when, for instance, Russian missiles fell on the territory of Poland, and there was no response.
Well, actually, NATO has invoked Article 5. The one and only time it did, it was after the horrible attacks of 9/11.
Yes, well, and it's a different scope.
No, it's a different scope of risk.
Yes.
But it's interesting to me that, when shit hit the fan, so to speak, our European allies stood up for us without a heartbeat. In fact, they actually the ones who, it wasn't us going to the North Atlantic Council saying, hey, let's invoke Article 5. They rose it on their own initiative. Which to me, I will never forget, because I was on Capitol Hill when we were evacuated and pulled out because they thought there were planes coming in the Capitol, in addition to the one that hit the Pentagon and the one that probably was in the White House. As for the risk of nuclear escalation, this is a deadly, serious issue. So one cannot be flippant with it. Look, if you're going to take on Russia, Russia is a nuclear power. You cannot, just flippantly dismiss that threat. But as I said, if you allow Russia to exercise nuclear coercion, you're actually laying the foundations for a more dangerous world, a world where you're more likely to see the spread of nuclear weapons, and you're more likely to see the actual exercise of nuclear weapons. So maybe by conceding to this nuclear coercion, we've avoided hard decisions in the near term. But I'll look you right in the eye and say with 100% certainty, we have made our future more risky and more dangerous. Second point I would make is that I think the Biden administration and some of our Europeans have exaggerated the threat of nuclear escalation in this conflict. Actually, by acceding to nuclear coercion, they've increased the threat. But let me put it this way, you've always got to be careful about projecting your value set on an adversary, and we have a tendency to do that. So I say this having thought a lot about how Putin looks at the world. And my sense is the following. What would be the value he would get about exercising nuclear weapons against a coalition or against Ukraine? Well, one, he'd have to take into account that we would respond with nuclear weapons. Does he really want that? Well, what if he just did it against the Ukrainians? Well, the Biden administration at least has communicated to Putin, did communicate to Putin, that there would be a catastrophic consequence to that. He doesn't quite know what that means. But he knows that we have sufficient arsenal conventionally to blow a hole in his lines of defense that would make vulnerable his current control over seized territories. It also strikes me as kind of strange if you're Putin and you are invading Ukraine to quote unquote return historic and treasured Russian lands, why would you nuke it? There's still a lot of ties, positive ties between Ukrainians and Russians. Family members, bloodlines that cross that border. How is detonating a nuclear weapon on your relatives going to really resonate in Russia? How is his armed forces going to feel about this? Recognizing kind of the military overmatch they face in the alliance. What would the exercise of nuclear weapons by Russia do to Russia's relationship with China, India, and other countries who've clearly signaled they don't want to see nuclear war anywhere? So I look at the situation and I go, I don't think, Putin really wants nuclear weapons. Another thing you can add is, if he used a limited demonstration, so to speak, shot of a tactical nuclear weapon, he'd get all the costs, but no military gain. If he used it against Ukrainian formations, even Russian analysts have written it would have limited use because the way the battlefields today with forces completely dispersed. So there'd be limited military utility in such a limited strike. So I think there are a lot of reasons for us to be a little bit more confident that decisive use of our military, economic, and ideological capabilities to stop this war on Ukrainian terms would involve risks of escalation that are manageable.
Thank you very much. Maybe my last question before we open
Sure.
the discussion. If you could assess and give the comparison of different approaches of ending the war. I mean, what is the European approach, how they see the end of the war in Ukraine? What is the view of the current Trump administration? And maybe if you could also give your assessment of what you personally think is the best, if there's a best way to end the war.
I stand back and say, when approaching this war, I look at those 5 or 6 factors that define what's at stake. So for me, this is an urgent priority for the United States. That is, priority to end this war on terms that are just, and that will be the foundation for enduring military stability in Europe. So I come with that perspective. Second, I'm concerned that the Biden administration, many of our European allies, and the Trump administration have been inhibited or have inhibited themselves from exercising the overmatch that we have over Russia out of an exaggerated fear of conflict with Russia. And it reflects that we've lost, or it communicates we've lost our resoluteness, our resolve, our readiness and determination to actually go to battle in defense of our values and interests. And I'm not looking for a war, but I'm telling you this is the way the world's beginning to look at the United States, not beginning, is looking at the United States and NATO. They think we've lost our will to fight. And so our adversaries are acting. As a result, we haven't leveraged our advantages. And I would leverage our advantages in the following way. I would say we need to have a coherent, comprehensive strategy to enable Ukraine to win and defeat this invasion. And the 5 elements would be as follows. First, we should be embracing Ukraine's war objectives. And by that I mean including total territorial reconstitution back to the borders of 2014. Those are the legal borders of Ukraine. Anything short, let me put it this way, we're just embracing Ukraine's objectives. If they want to change their objectives, that's their call. But we should be backing them full hilt. Anything short of that basically is a disillusioning statement to Ukrainians. It says, we're not with you. They're now not sure what the West is going to support, what they should be really fighting for, what they should risk their lives for. Anything short of embracing Ukraine's objectives is basically giving the green light, a signal of encouragement to Putin to drive on. So by failing to meet that standard, we're basically encouraging Putin to stick to his guns. Second, it's obvious, give the Ukrainians all the weapons and assistance we can, military assistance, without restrictions on their use. Third, we should be body slamming the Russian economy. Real full-scale sanctions. I mean, think about it. The Russian economy grew about 3% in 2024. 3%. That's higher than our growth rate. That's higher than most growth rates of Europe. That says a lot about the adequacy of our sanctions regime and our enforcement of the sanctions that we did in place. We can body slam the Russian economy if we're willing to endure a little bit of economic sacrifice. Fourth, we should be engaged, we should be directly engaging the key stakeholders in Russian politics. By that I mean the population, business leaders, political parties. That we should have full-scale information operations to basically generate, support, sustain political opposition within Russia to Putin's war, if not against the Putin regime. You know, it's amazing to me we're not doing this after Russia has blatantly been waging an information war against our own elections. Our presidential and congressional elections last year, the European elections today, and it's been going on for years. And we don't have to use this information. We can weaponize the power of the truth, just as we did when Russia was invading Afghanistan in the 1980s. There's a lot of horror that we can share with the Russian public about what their young people are being subjected to, and what their young people are being made to do against people they consider to be, you know, almost relatives. There's a lot we can do in that area. Let's weaponize the power of truth. And then finally, you put Ukraine onto a clear path to NATO membership. Because as I mentioned, that's the only thing that Putin respects. That's the only way to prove to Putin that Ukraine is not vulnerable and available to his hegemonic ambitions. Those are the 5 elements of a strategy to help end this war on terms that are just and that are the foundation for enduring military stability and maybe eventually a peace in Europe.
Thank you for this comment. Now we're gonna open the floor to the audience, and you know, much more questions we would like to discuss, but please, I know you're also interested in these issues. We don't have time to cover. Maybe someone would like to ask about Saudi Arabia and current negotiations that are happening there, also European involvement, Ukraine, and feel free to. Maybe we should collect a few questions.
So I'm Mateo. I'm an undergrad here at the LA School. Thank you so much for being here. My question would be sort of to summarize very in sort of a blunt way. We should be punching Russia in the jaw. They should be reeling from what NATO is able to do. That should be our response. What would your response be to the European countries that do have that fear? How do we get the rest of Europe on our side with these sanctions, with using our overmatched NATO as a threat, with sticking to our guns and upholding our word? How do we get other people on our side?
Well, the Biden administration was probably in a better position to do that because of its more positive relationship with the Europeans. To get in the weeds here, we now have a new administration in town, and as you've seen, they've been taking a very different tack. So this is what I tell the Europeans. One, you got to recognize that Trump doesn't think that we have a dog in this fight. He doesn't think, this is a real American concern, this is really a European concern. Second thing that I emphasize to them is, unlike the Biden administration and the Obama administration, which had a ponderous decision-making process, a lot of interagency reviews, and studies, and thoughtfulness, and that sort of thing, it always yielded nothing more than incremental decisions. This new team in town is all about fast decisions, maybe gut-driven rather than thoughtful, analytic decisions, and always looking for big decisions, presidential level outcomes. So they have a limited time to shape the Trump administration's perspective. Third is that I probably said this at second, Trump's position is still evolving. It's evolving now in the wrong direction, but they're still trying to figure out what this team trying to figure out what they want to do, and you can tell, but from the incoherent statements coming from senior officials contradictory statements over the last several weeks. So recognize it. Trump doesn't look at this as an American concern. Two, he's thinking hard about how to bring peace to this, end this war. And three, he's going to make a decision really fast. So what the Europeans need to do, and another I'd add, is that Trump is not going to be more determined than the Europeans. So if they're not determined, he's not going to make them determined. They come in and show that they're determined, then I think he's willing to maybe consider it, particularly if he thinks the outcome is going to be a victory. And I believe we have the overmatch necessary to make this a decisive victory for the West. So what I tell the Europeans you got to come to Washington like now. In fact, Radek Sikorski is in town, Polish foreign minister. I think he's probably the most effective European diplomat and the one best positioned to change attitudes in the Trump administration. You've got Macron from France, the Prime Minister of France, and the Prime Minister of the UK coming in next week. They ought to come in, and say, put a little anti-Biden edge on it, but basically, because that's what always makes Trump happy. Come in and say, hey, we're so glad you're here. You won this election. We've endured 4 years of indecision from Trump, from Biden, which never allowed us to exercise our power. Mr. President, now that you're here and you're all about decisive things, we're ready to put on the table a package of action that's going to make this a win for you. First, we're ready to ramp up economic sanctions. We're going to body slam this Russian economy. We're going to shut down its war industry. Two, we're ready to stand with you and work with the Russian people to turn them against this war. And three, we're ready to stand up a deterrent force that will go into Ukraine and secure this peace. 2 to 3 divisions. Mr. President, 2 to 3 divisions of European forces. And all we're looking at is, from the United States, maybe a 10 to 15% contribution. A headquarters element, some air missile defense, complementing European air missile defense, long-range fires, complementing European long-range fires, and above all, your intelligence. Because that's the secret sauce that'll give us, that operational edge. Mr. President, all we're looking is for that 10%. And you don't have to deploy a single additional troop from continental United States. You can do it with your forces in theater. And by the way, your contribution will be rear echelon. Because the headquarters would be in the back, Europeans would have the ground forces up forward. I could get into details of what they would do, but that's the bargain. And then you look at the president in the eye and you go, hey, we do this, what do you get? You're the one who brings peace to Europe, just as you promised. Two, this is a real itch for President Trump, you will clearly avoid a wider war that could entangle U.S. forces, not just in Europe, but in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific. That's the one thing that Trump fears the most, is being entangled in a wider war. 3, you come in and you say, this is the way you demonstrate that you're Churchill, not Chamberlain, and that your peace through strength strategy or national security policy has credibility. And then 4th, Mr. President, you'll be the first president in the history of NATO that will have gotten the Europeans to carry their share of the burden. So take this, take it. And you're basically also positioning him in a position where if he doesn't take it, he looks weak. And we know Trump does not like looking weak. And the Europeans need to do this, and they need to do it now. Because there are 3 courses of action that Trump could take. 1 is to jam an unfair, unstable peace upon the Ukrainians unilaterally. And it seems to be the path he could be on right now. 2, he could go, you know, this is a European problem. There's no win here for me. You guys are on your own. And I'll stick my neck out. Or 3, he'll do something decisive in support of this war, the anti-Biden thing. I know if the Europeans don't make that offer I'm suggesting, the first one ain't possible, and the 3rd option isn't possible, ain't gonna happen, and one of the first 2 options are almost for certain. So that's what I will do to convince Trump to do the right thing.
Maybe all questions together.
You go first.
I'd like to ask, has there actually been any, like, say, intelligence reports that state whether Moscow has ever seriously considered the nuclear option? And also, like, why has the United States and European Union has taken Putin's threats seriously despite the lack of, despite Ukraine crossing the supposed red line for Russia's, like, using the nuclear option, such as even invading Kursk?
Yes, just to piggyback off that, there have been a lot of things over the past 2 to 3 years that Ukraine has done, that frankly, or that the West has done through NATO, that should have provoked further action from Putin, given the scary address that he gave on the 21st of February 2022, and the other supposed threats that he's given since. There was the attack on the Kerch Bridge, there was the Kursk incursion, and then there was the ascension of Finland into NATO, which I would argue has a lot of underrated strategic implications for weakening Russian power in the Baltic, as well as securing very important positions in Luhansk, in that area, in the north. So because of that, I see that there has been a series of actions that have been taken by Ukraine or by the West, and I don't even mention the aid, that suggest that the actions you're suggesting, with Ukraine being added into NATO immediately, or any sort of radical action like deploying troops that Macron was suggesting last year, that there should not be as much fear that Putin will throw a nuke over to us. I don't really see why there is any sort of fear or hesitation. But that's one thing. Another thing is, and you might need to get back to me for this, but I'm also a bit confused. I love that suggestion that you just gave, as far as what the British, what the French should come to DC and say to Trump to his face, put him in a position where he needs to support Ukraine, he needs to support the alliance, or look weak. I'm just curious to hear what is going on in the inner discussions of Berlin, or Paris, or London. What is being said over there that suggests that when they come to DC, when Starmer comes, when Macron comes, that will be what is on the table? Because I genuinely think that's a realistic thing that they could do if they were taking the situation seriously. So since they're coming, I would suggest that they would be taking this seriously, and they might go ahead with that same proposal you just gave. But what's going on in those three big cities to suggest that is happening? Sorry, that was a long
Please give them shorter overtime, so maybe Julian and Carter, if you can just one sentence phrase the question.
I guess I can make mine really simple. What would sanctions actually do to convince Russia for peace? Like you can see how sanctions, for example, Iran, for example, they only affect the Iranian people. The leadership doesn't really care. So like how would it actually push Russia towards peace or wanting to get any sort of agreement? Like they're self-reliant on military technology, military production, economic production. So I just want your take as to how to actually help.
And I guess for the last question, given the policy needs of Ukraine post-war and with a ceasefire in place or a peace deal agreed upon, in your expertise as someone who works with NATO policy, what do you think would be the biggest priorities for Ukraine's military to rebuild? What should they focus on first and foremost to rebuild their military and kind of align it in a way that is most lethal to fight Russia?
Starting with the last question, I don't get that deep into the weeds of force structure. I would say off the top of my head, for the Ukrainians, it would be to do whatever is necessary to further integrate their forces into, increase your interoperability and integration into the alliance's forces. So that's some command and control capabilities. That's some security capabilities in terms of information. On the hardware side, it would mean continuing to invest in everything they need to fully equip their soldiers. And one kind of a debate of how much armor they should have, how much air force they should have, what kind of air and missile defense capabilities they'll need. Probably more than they have right now, so they can become really, really kind of a hardened target, so to speak, against Russian aggression. They would probably also want to, rebuild, reconstruct to a certain degree their defense industry. And they got to do that on top of rebuilding their economy, which has been, devastated by these Russian attacks, the infrastructure, the energy, and that's, other elements of economic infrastructure that the Russians have systematically gone after to weaken them. That's a very broad answer, but that's a good question. It's a very thoughtful question. On the intel about Russia's nuclear coercion, there is in the open press reports that the Russians actually were moving around nuclear weapons in a way that really set off alarm bells in the Biden administration. So they thought that we were on the cusp of nuclear war, and it actually precipitated the Biden administration to harden their line, and they went to Putin and read the Riot Act, that if there was going to be an exercise of such a weapon, Russia would face cataclysmic consequences, which is the right thing for the Biden administration to do. And I think they handled that situation appropriately. But part of the reason why they got into that situation was because I think we were signaling that we were intimidated by Russian nuclear threats. And so when Russia felt it was getting into a hard situation with the success that the Ukrainians were having with their counteroffensive of 2022, 23, we set the conditions for Putin to think that actually maybe moving towards a nuclear weapon, or at least making that kind of blatant signaling an effective tool. So, an effective reaction by Biden, but they set the circumstances that led the Russians in part to feel they could get away with that act. What are the Europeans doing? What's the state of debate? Well, ever since 2014, up until about a year ago, the Europeans just kind of looking at the United States and hoping this would go away. They were always eager to negotiate with the Russians. You could see that occasional outreach by Macron and such. But maybe the impending arrival or return of President Trump to the White House was a splash of cold water on him and brought a bit of realism. So for the first time, we're having in Europe a serious debate about actually deploying European forces into Ukraine. Macron on Monday, and then this last Wednesday, had meetings he organized to basically discuss this issue. That's a big change in their attitude. It's sad that it had to be driven by their fear that the United States was about to abandon Ukraine. I also think that we weren't doing much to really push them in this direction during the Biden years. But at least Biden seemed to be really determined to support Ukraine. That signal isn't coming as strongly from Trump today. And recognition to that signal, along with the fear that Trump might actually abandon Europe, has stiffened the spine of our Europeans. So that's why Macron's hosting these meetings. That's why Starmer has signaled that he's willing to do that. Other Europeans have quietly signaled they're ready to participate. But I got to tell you, I am not confident that a European-only force, deterrent force, is going to be sufficient to defend or to quote-unquote deter further Russian aggression. I think it'll actually be a magnet for Russian aggression, because Putin doesn't believe the Europeans have the wherewithal and the spine to stand up to a real war with them. So I'm very worried that the Europeans won't come to town and make that robust offer. Because if there is an American dimension to this deterrent force, and this deterrent force is big enough, and I really don't think 30,000 troops is going to suffice. 30,000 troops is about what we had in West Berlin during the Cold War. We're talking about a country or a leader, Putin, who's determined to suborn Ukraine, destroy its culture, and is willing to lose hundreds of thousands of Russians towards that end. So it's going to take a real fist to demonstrate that we've got the commitment and readiness to not only blow a hole in Russian lines in Ukraine, but in doing so blow a hole in the foundations of his political existence. And my guess is, more is always better, but my guess is 2 to 3 divisions in the robust enabling capacity, that's the air defense, long-range fires, and aircraft, with an American leg in it, would be suffice to do that. So I'll be watching with real care, real anticipation, real fear to a certain degree with these visits next week, because the Trump administration is going to make a decision fast on this. That's what he is. He looks at kind of like a hedge fund. Put out 10 bits of investment here, see what's winning, drive forward with that tuition, and those that don't look like winners, you pull off right away. But Europe can influence this. They can put beforehand, hey, we can make you, Mr. Trump, look really good. We can help you avoid your worst fear. We can make you get the Nobel Peace Prize. I think they can actually capture him. Particularly juxtaposed against that is the threat of that if you don't take up our offer, which you just make a low-cost investment, you could end up looking really bad and really, really weak. And that is not only a threat to your reputation, but an avenue to a wider engulfing war.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Brzezinski, for joining us today. I think we had.
Well, can I throw a couple questions? You got time for that? How many of you think we ought to be involved in a deterrent force in Ukraine? Wow, it's a lot more than I thought. Thanks, appreciate that.
Yeah. Sorry that we couldn't take more questions, but we're running really out of time. We would like to thank you for being today with us, and we prepared a little.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today.